Next up, we have Dr. Paul Deane, who's from UCC. He's an energy expert, and he's going to give us an energetically short presentation on agriculture emissions, the cars versus cows debate. Here's everything you ever wanted to know about cows and carbon.
Thanks, Catherine. That's a great introduction. Energy expert, I'm not so sure. I think more appropriately, let me just qualify my credentials for tonight. I grew up on a farm in Kerry, a small 40-acre farm just outside Tralee in the 80s, which wasn't really the golden era of Irish agriculture. So I think I've been trampled by cows. I've fallen off silage pits. I've pulled myself out of slurry pits. So I think anything I've learned about agriculture has been either through economic hardship or physical hardship. But tonight, let me talk about something a small bit different. I'm going to share with you some of the elements of Irish agriculture. Not the most interesting elements, unfortunately, the elements around emissions and the elements around climate and energy policy. I have 5 minutes. I've got to do this energetically, so I'm not going to get to know you. We're going to jump straight into this. I'm going to hit you with some hard facts, so hang on to your seats. Here we go. Agriculture is vitally important to Ireland, not only culturally, economically, socially, but the economic aspect is enormous, 24 billion into our economy. And we export most of our agricultural produce that we produce here in Ireland, and that's important. In terms of land use, about 80% of the agricultural land is given over to grass and 10% to crops. And another important point to remember is that the dairy that we produce here in Ireland has got one of the lowest carbon footprints in the world. So in terms of the dairy that we produce, Ireland is more or less world class. The beef, a little bit behind that. Interestingly enough, we have the lowest level of organic land in Europe. We're less than 2%. Austria would be the highest at about 17%. And we also have the lowest level of forestry cover in Europe. In terms of demographics, it's certainly a male-dominated sector. 12% of farms are owned by females, and it's certainly an older and maybe a wiser man's game, where the average age of a farmer is in his late 50s, and 30% of farms are owned by people who are over the age of 65. So there's some quick facts on agriculture. But Ireland is actually very unique in terms of its place in Europe in how we think about agriculture and its interactions with energy. You know, when we often think about climate change, we think about, power plants belching CO2 out into the atmosphere. But for Ireland, it's very different. For us, the majority of our emissions come from agriculture, primarily from cattle who belch, and then the rest of those emissions come from manure management and fertilizer. So up here, what we see is how we consume energy in Ireland today. And you notice that electricity is 20% of the electricity that we consume, but still it dominates the airways in conversations that we have in Ireland around climate change. Agriculture consumes very little energy, but still produces the majority of our emissions, 32%. That's about 18 million tons. Just to break that down for you, that's about 4.5 times what Money Point coal-fired power plant pumps into the atmosphere every year. So it's about 4.5 times Money Point. And just a little factoid: a cow will generally produce the same emissions as an average family car every year. So you can look at your car in that way. And we have a lot of emissions in Ireland. It's not that agriculture is not efficient in Ireland. It is very efficient. It's just that we have lots of cows. We have 6 million cows, 6.3 million or more or less or cattle to be exact. And it's not easy to reduce emissions in agriculture. The most effective way is to reduce activity in the sector, and that's kind of a cold economic word for saying you get rid of the cows and get rid of some of the farms. So and emissions are 32% today, about 18 million tons. Projections out to 2030 would show that emissions more or less staying around between 18 and 19 million tons of CO2. So not much movement in those projections as we go out to the future. Part of the work that we do down in UCC, this is first of all, this is a Sankey diagram. This is a very colourful diagram, explains how energy flows into the Irish system, where we get our energy from, the fuel types, and the sectors that we use it in. So again, you can see agriculture in terms of energy is more or less insignificant. The emissions are not shown here, but we saw them on the last slide. And part of the work that we do down in UCC is that we use computer models to understand how this picture of the energy system in Ireland will develop, will evolve as the economy evolves, as prices of fossil fuel evolve, and how our level of ambition for climate change, how that interacts with the energy system as well. Now, we use computer models, and the wonderful thing about computer models is that if you like the story coming from them, you can say it's great, there's science behind it, there's mathematics, this must be true. And the other great thing is that if you don't like the story, you can say it's a computer model and it's rubbish and they're completely wrong. But computer models are very useful. We don't make predictions with computer models. If we could predict the future, we would probably end up doing something about it. So what we generally do is that computer models provide insights, they provide scenarios, they provide information of how things may evolve under a certain set of conditions. So the work that we do in this project, is funded by the EPA and SEAI, is that we look how this picture will change out to the year 2050. And when we're looking at the energy system in Ireland, what's very important is to understand, well, what happens to agriculture, the bulk of our emissions. And in that conversation, two narratives really evolve. The first one kind of says, well, we need to acknowledge the low carbon intensity of Irish agriculture. We need to acknowledge the contribution that Irish agriculture makes to global food production. And we need to maybe give some kind of special consideration for emissions coming from agriculture, or some kind of a pass, if you will, when it comes to emissions from agriculture. And the logic for that is really founded in the fact that if we reduce the herds here in Ireland, if we stop producing as much milk, the markets will remain and the production of the produce will move elsewhere. And there's some really good literature out there to show that while we may reduce emissions in Ireland, that will probably lead to a global overall increase in emissions. So that's one argument for saying that, well, we need to consider agriculture and it needs to be looked at differently in consideration of its low carbon contribution. The other argument says, well, rubbish that. Every sector must pull its weight. If we start making considerations or making dispensations for Irish agriculture, well, then shouldn't coal in Poland get the same treatment? Shouldn't steel in Germany get the same treatment? So they're the kind of two arguments that evolve when we talk about where agriculture goes into the future. And both have merit, and I think both have weaknesses and both have strong points. Let's look at one of our graphs here from the year 2050. So let's jump into the future, and we will be talking a little bit about 2050 later on. This Sankey diagram shows one specific scenario of what the energy system in Ireland, now the energy system is just heat, transport and electricity. What the energy system would look like if we reduced our emissions by 80%. And we can achieve this at a cost that's more or less comparable to what other EU member states can achieve. So it's technically and economically very plausible and very feasible. If we look at agriculture on this, if you want to achieve an overall economy-wide 80% reduction, and the reason why I'm using 80% is that 80% is the figure that we reckon we need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to keep temperatures to a 2-degree increase. So that's where the 80% comes in. If we look at an overall economy reduction of 80%, that means then that agriculture has to significantly reduce its emissions by 80% or greater. And that's very, very challenging. And we're going to hear maybe later on about some of the options and some of the challenges and maybe some of the opportunities for reducing emissions from agriculture. What our analysis also shows is that, well, what if agriculture cannot significantly reduce its emissions? What happens then? And then the issue is, well, the burden gets flipped back over to the energy system. The energy system will need to do more. Let me throw out two examples. If agriculture can reduce its emissions by half, then the energy system to achieve an 80% reduction will look something like this. The energy system will have to go over and above 80% and reduce emissions by 95%. Technically, it's possible, but it's an energy system which is an awful lot more expensive. If we go beyond that, and just to finish up, what if agriculture cannot reduce its emissions? What if emissions stay in 2050 at 18 million tonnes, the same they are today? Then, to achieve an emissions reduction of 80%, the energy system must produce negative emissions. And I have no diagram for that because it is impossible. So the take-home message that I would like to add to this conversation is what happens in agriculture in Ireland matters in energy, more so than any other member state. There are trade-offs, culturally, environmentally, socially, and economically. We need to be mindful of these trade-offs, but the trade-offs are not just at a local level in terms of communities, they can also be at a global level in terms of overall emissions, emissions production from greenhouse gases. So thank you very much for listening.